Just a quick glance through my video history will probably give away the fact that I love Silent Hill. Whenever answering the question of what my favorite game of all time is, I always cheat and answer with the original Silent Hill trilogy. I really can't pick a favorite, they're all winners in my book. However, the key word there is trilogy, because despite Team Silent having made 4 of the games, and despite my best efforts to enjoy it, I have a strong dislike for Silent Hill 4. Subtitled The Room, Silent Hill 4 is the kind of game that in most circumstances I would have written off as a disappointment and moved on. What makes this game different though is how in the past 5 years or so, it seemed to receive a large influx of support and fanfare, with Silent Hill 4 fans coming out of the woodwork singing its praises. They call it a forgotten gem, an underappreciated masterpiece, a misunderstood titan standing toe-to-toe with the 3 which precede it, and more similar praises. I'll be blunt, I don't get it. Despite all of my best efforts to share the same opinion, and yeah, that's pretty pathetic on my part, I've always failed to see Silent Hill 4 as anything more than an interesting, yet subpar horror game. Today, I'm finally going to try and sum up all of my disparate thoughts and complaints on the game. Hopefully, others will understand my stance on it once we're through here, and I can explain why, despite my love for the series, I just can't get into its final entry. Well, it's true final entry. Even those who defend Silent Hill 4 will admit its gameplay hurdles. To some degree, it seems like almost everyone admits that it's a rough game to play. If you had to boil down Silent Hill 4 to its core mechanic, it seems that combat takes center stage this time around. The game has much more enemies that the player has to deal with, the enemies are faster and more aggressive than most others from past games, and the player is forced into combat situations more often than prior entries. A common complaint lobbed against the Silent Hill series as a whole is the awkward and unsatisfying combat, which, if we're being honest, is a fair criticism. I doubt anyone is going to argue that these games are thrilling, edge-of-your-seat action joyrides, but Silent Hill 1 to 3 always gave you ways to mitigate it. Guns were always viable options with a relative abundance of ammo available, which made actually killing enemies far easier. From a gameplay design standpoint, the sheer amount of ammo given to the player in Silent Hill 1 and 2 might not have been the best idea for constructing a rich survival horror game, but this ties into the core point about Silent Hill as a franchise, which we'll touch on a bit later. On the other hand, even if you did run out of bullets and wanted to avoid the melee combat, it was viable to just run away from enemies, and with some practice you could juke and jive around without taking any hits. Silent Hill 4, on the other hand, changed up the formula a bit. On top of the combat essentially being forced onto the player more often, melee weapons now are the primary way the player will find themselves disposing of monsters. This is due to a reduced amount of ammo up for grabs, a decreased focus on guns with only 2 becoming available, and changes to the game's new 10-slot limited inventory which strongly discourage holding onto ammo as it no longer stacks. Each magazine is now its own item, rather than adding up to a total amount. Yet, for all of its newfound emphasis on melee combat, Silent Hill 4 is actually a step down from the past games. Most melee weapons are just straight upgrades from the past, which means they lack the more interesting situational advantages of certain weapons found in past games. The golf clubs themselves also are more of a hindrance than anything, barely doing more damage than the starting pipe, yet also breaking and stealing an inventory slot which the player can't clear until returning to the hub. For the regular weapons, there are no valid uses for them once you find the next one, and once you pick up the axe, you're never going to want to put that bad boy down. Just breaking it down to the actual mechanics, the other games also had more intuitive attacks. It was simple but effective. The basics were, hold down the right trigger to ready the weapon, tap X to do a quick hit, which you could do multiple times for a combo, and hold X to do a strong single swing. Silent Hill 3 added some additional layers of complexity here, with the second holding attack, a stab, being able to be performed by holding the left stick forward while attacking, and a timed parry which could block incoming attacks and let you counter off of it. It's all very basic stuff, and even Silent Hill 3 was still a little stiff, but it worked well enough should you have to engage in it. In Silent Hill 4, well, it's the same light combo system, but a new charge attack leaves something to be desired. Basically, the player holds X like they did in the past games, but a new circle meter on the UI fills up. Once full, the player pulls off one massive charge attack, the animation for which is a long series of invincibility frames. Seeing how you take no damage during the long charge, and it does more damage than the regular combo strings, the combat encounters just become attempts to abuse the iframe attack for both your offense and defense. While the game does have a dodge, it's slow, unwieldy, and a clear step down from the simple parry found in Silent Hill 3. The iframe attack is head and shoulders the better option, and the fact that the player is actively incentivized to think about this kind of thing in a survival horror game is a bizarre choice. And then there are the guns. On top of the inventory system, which penalizes players for using them, the game's auto-aim is downright poor, with slight elevation changes causing it to freak out and miss the target entirely. In short, the combat of Silent Hill 4 is less interesting and more intrusive than that of the prior games, despite how it really is the primary mechanic which the player will engage in. It's subpar and intrudes on the player, taking them out of the experience. So, the combat is a bit of a bust. This would hardly be a concern in the past games, however. In the trilogy, the puzzles were the true center stage of the gameplay. Each main area is centered around the puzzles that the player had to solve, with the combat and enemies being something to spice things up in between. Puzzles are indeed present in Silent Hill 4, albeit in a more restricted manner. However, they're much less thoughtful and compelling than those in prior games. This might sound odd to some, as the puzzles in Silent Hill 4 are usually given high praise from its defenders, a common example being a task where the player has to retrieve chocolate milk from the hub apartment to take back into the nightmare world. However, this one clever example highlights my base issue with the puzzles. They're redundant, with the two solutions to the vast majority of them being placing object A at location B, or the more common roadblock. Stuck in the other world and can't progress further? Head back to the apartment, look for a newly spawned solution, what has changed inside, or what new information is now available. Sometimes, like the chocolate milk example, the solution is a mix of the two. The game is inconsistent with these two. While you can pick up the chocolate milk at any time, as it's available in the fridge, the room key to apartment 303 only spawns in the apartment once a specific note has been read. It's just lying around on the floor when you find it too, so there really isn't a justification for it not being present from the get-go. The puzzles here are weak in comparison to the past 3 games in general, but one aspect of Silent Hill 4 that is especially a letdown is that the poetry puzzles are absent. In the trilogy, some of the fairly simple puzzle solutions were hidden behind a word game or poem. These were usually fairly clever, and a real testament to the writing and specifically the localization for these games. A few examples of what I'm talking about include the bird and piano key poem from the first game, the hangman puzzle of Silent Hill 2, and the tarot card puzzle from Silent Hill 3, and these are only a handful. Silent Hill 4 really lacks any creative writing to try and elude the puzzle solutions, simply spelling out the answer for players. You can see this in the bloody bed and phone call puzzles, just for a couple examples. Further on the topic of things that Silent Hill 4 does worse than past games, the level design on display here is downright poor. All 5 of the main worlds in the hospital the player visit are pretty damn lazy. Just to make the comparison again, the Silent Hill trilogy was usually fairly clever. The average level in these games usually attempted to take a real-world location with a somewhat realistic layout and turn it into a compelling video game level. Team Silent did so by placing roadblocks and creating detours along the way, usually locked doors and puzzle blockades, which in turn would force the player to traverse through the location in a somewhat non-linear fashion. It's no Resident Evil in regards to the level design, and of course once you know how to beat these levels, it really does just boil down to a straight shot to the end, but that illusion of openness in the first playthrough works quite well. Silent Hill 4 doesn't even have the illusion, as practically every level in the game boils down to a straight line, with few levels providing a good reason to go off the beaten path to explore. Largely because there usually isn't anything besides the beaten path. Just compare the subways from Silent Hill 3 and 4. The former has multiple layers, plenty of areas off the required path which provide resources for the curious player, the shotgun which you can totally progress through the game without picking up, a unique scare on the train tracks, and a rare chance event of encountering closers that no one really knows how to trigger to this day. On top of the area needing you to loop around and explore a bit, the whole area can be run through in no time once the player knows the actual path to take. In Silent Hill 4, the subway is beyond linear, with little incentive to check out side rooms, and the closest thing to an engaging layout being a segment where you have to traverse through a subway car maze. While it may seem unfair to compare these back to back just based on a similar theme, the difference in quality really goes to show how Silent Hill 4 drops the ball with its level design, especially considering how the Silent Hill 3 subway is generally regarded as one of the game's weaker areas. The forest and city worlds follow a similar path as the subway, neither being especially great or poor. The hospital is essentially a transition area that really shouldn't count, and the apartment world is the closest Silent Hill 4 comes to capturing that level layout style of its predecessors. Then there is the water prison. Oh boy. We'll really dig into this one a while later, but for now I just want to stress how annoying the traversal options are, even on the first run through. The real key word there is stressing that it's the first run, because this segues nicely into one of Silent Hill 4's most common criticisms. The second half of the game tasks the player with returning to all of the prior levels for a second run through, with the barest changes made to them. No new layouts, and hardly any additional areas bar for a basement in the forest world and a boss arena in the city world. There's no way to beat around the bush on this one. The only reason you have to loop around on the levels is more than likely the rushed development time of Silent Hill 4. It's unfortunate, and I understand the probable reason why, even though I openly admit that I have zero evidence for this, but if we're being perfectly fair, Silent Hill does have a history of repeating levels. There's nowhere from Silent Hill 1, Brookhaven and Silent Hill 3, and some could argue that the Otherworld segments also count as level reuse. In fact, proponents of Silent Hill 4 do argue this, saying how critics are overplaying how bad 4's reuse actually is, based on the past instances. I strongly disagree. Let's run through the 3 comparable examples from the trilogy. Nowhere is the closest example, considering that area is really just old level assets reused with next to no changes given to them. The major difference here is the scope of the reuse. While Silent Hill 4 copy and pastes nearly the entire game up to that point, Nowhere only reused select levels from multiple different areas. It remixed these rooms to create a brand new level layout, meaning that you weren't just running through the exact same paths that you had up to that point. Even segments taken from the same levels had their orders remixed for you. Plus, we just have to look at the quantity of reuse here. Silent Hill 1 has a single level that's guilty of this kind of reuse. Silent Hill 4 has 5. Needless to say, this is a poor comparison for Silent Hill 4. The comparison made between how the Otherworld worked in the trilogy to the second half of the room is also faulty. There is a massive visual transition from the regular Fog World locations to the Otherworld. So just from an aesthetic standpoint, there really is no comparison between them and the virtual complete lack of change seen in Silent Hill 4. On top of that, the actual layout of the Otherworld style levels changes along with the new look, with floors and rooms being added, paths being rerouted, and so on. The real key to why the comparison doesn't work is due to something those in favor of it seem to look over. Not every level in Silent Hill had both a Fog and Otherworld segment. More often than not, either variant of the level is either not there, or is so short that it hardly counts as a level at all. The only instances of the player having to explore both a Fog and Otherworld level are Midwich Elementary in Silent Hill 1, Brookhaven, and possibly the Lakeview Hotel in Silent Hill 2, and both Hilltop Center and the Brookhaven redo in Silent Hill 3. In Silent Hill 4, you have to repeat the subway, forest, prison world, city, and apartment worlds. Breaking this down to just numbers, Silent Hill 1 has you repeat a single level, Silent Hill 2 has you repeat either 1 or 2, depending on how you want to look at it, and Silent Hill 3 has you repeating 2. Silent Hill 4 has you repeating 5. Needless to say, With the quantity and lack of variety seen within the rehash, Silent Hill 4 is significantly worse in this aspect than all of the prior games, even if we accepted the argument of the Otherworld itself being rehash. The only one of the comparisons that is actually somewhat valid is the Brookhaven redo in Silent Hill 3, as that is an example of a past game straight up reusing a level in its near entirety from an older title. This is a flaw, make no mistake, but even still, I'd argue Silent Hill 3 makes better use of this rehash than 4 does. While the Fog World run is extremely similar to how it was in Silent Hill 2, the Otherworld variant uses the art direction to more than make up for the repetition, and this is on top of how Brookhaven as it is, even when reused, is still a better designed level than anything present in Silent Hill 4, so while the reuse is certainly not ideal, it's far from as tedious as running through all 5 worlds again is in Silent Hill 4. And just a minor gripe about the level design in Silent Hill 4, well, what's with all the ridiculous roadblocks? The funky creature things, the flying bugs, the leeches, the wall men in this escalator, which might be the single most infuriating room in any survival horror game, and more. The game loves just irritating the player with these annoying roadblocks, just slowing them down. The second gig is even worse with these kind of things, by adding one big one that sticks with you from the very beginning of the second half to the very end of the game. Gentlemen, meet Eileen Galvin. Eileen is the other most contentious aspect of Silent Hill 4, at least from a game design standpoint, with the audience split seemingly right down the middle about her. You see, after she gets beaten up and trapped in the Otherworld, Eileen becomes the player's hanger-on escort character from that point onward, meaning that the second half of Silent Hill 4 is one long escort quest. It is worth noting that Silent Hill does have a history of escort quests, which defenders of the fourth game will bring up, as Silent Hill 2 has a not insignificant chunk of its runtime dedicated to the player running around with Maria. I've never actually heard anyone complain about the latter option in Maria, yet Eileen is one of the more divisive elements. Why is that? Well, it really boils down to 2 elements, a lack of control and a lack of required investment. Maria as an escort can be controlled to an even lesser degree than Eileen, but the reason she works is because you really don't have to concern yourself with her. She'll always follow you automatically, even teleporting into new rooms after you no matter where she was prior to you entering. Sure, Maria could die theoretically, even be killed by the player directly, but enemies rarely focused on her. Honestly, you have to actively try to get Maria hurt or killed for it to happen, or simply just get extremely unlucky. In short, Maria was never really an issue to have around, so while you could never really control her actions, you didn't have to dedicate much mental energy to managing her, and she never really held the player back. Eileen is the opposite in this regard. While defenders of the game will point out how Eileen is functionally immortal, this fact doesn't negate the issue that having her around actually does hamper the player in quite a number of ways. For starters, most of the level progression in the second half is designed around finding ways for the crippled Eileen to traverse the environments, due to her broken arm and leg. Eileen can't climb ladders and such, which is, to be fair, an actually quite novel idea for level progression. Trying to work around another character's limitations, forcing you to make alternative paths. Here's where the problem arises though. Eileen frequently gets caught on the level geometry and enemies, which is an issue considering Eileen will not follow you through doors unless she's pretty close to the player. If she's caught on enemies and too far away, she'll stay behind, meaning that you have to run on back and grab her. And this is even when she's unarmed. Should you choose to arm her, Eileen develops a bloodlust that would make the Doom Marine proud, foregoing any evasive movements in favor of ineffectually beating enemies to death. This is all on top of how Eileen moves at half of the movement speed of the player, if that. So more often than not, you'll be idling around doors, waiting for Eileen to catch up with you, all the while under attack from enemies or taking damage from the ghosts, who we'll get to later. Basically, while the idea of Eileen as an escort with movement limitations isn't inherently a bad one, Silent Hill 4's implementation of it is so poor that it leaves you longing for the days of Maria. As bare bones as that escort was from a mechanical standpoint, it was never annoying or progression hampering. You have too little control over Eileen for the game to be demanding this much investment from the player. Let's look at an alternative example. Ashley from Resident Evil 4 is, at least in my opinion, the absolute best escort character in any video game, executing a much maligned gameplay mechanic perfectly. It's deceptively simple. Ashley will always fall directly behind the player by default. She has a wait and follow command, which is really all of the control that the player needs over her. She could hide in designated hiding spots, meaning that enemies couldn't attack her while in there. And speaking of the enemies, their primary objective is to capture Ashley, not kill her. While she can't die, enemies will instead try to pick her up and carry her to an exit, giving the player some leeway to save her. I could go on a full tangent about how well Ashley is designed, but to cut it short, she's a great addition to RE4. Comparing Eileen to her makes for an even worse contrast than Maria. The fact that you have zero control over Eileen, while the game still requires you to work around her limits as a mechanic, is really what kills it. Eileen lacks the interactivity of Ashley and the convenience of Maria. She's somewhat awkwardly placed in the middle, never really a benefit to have around, and more often than not an outright irritation, continually taking the player out of the experience. Eileen isn't the end of the immersion ruining mechanics, since the ghosts are around to get on my nerves. This is the one thing that I'll be taking a very contrarian stance on, because while basically all fans of Silent Hill 4 sing the praises of the ghosts, I found them to be extremely underwhelming. The ghosts range from either annoying to goofy background obstacles. The ghosts are invincible, yet extremely slow and unthreatening enemies that ineffectually float towards you. Their attacks are extremely easy to avoid, and I have to stress, they move at a snail's pace. So, why are they a problem? Outside of how they can hold up Eileen in cramped areas, unless you waste an inventory slot and equip a Saint Medallion, the ghosts do proximity damage by simply being in the player's presence. This is probably the most baffling choice of the ghosts. Why make a walking poison damage type enemy that doesn't even have to touch you to do the damage in the first place? On top of that, while fear is certainly a subjective topic, I've never understood people who found the ghosts scary. Fans of Silent Hill 4 praise the game for this, but to me they just look silly. It's just a humanoid model slowly floating towards the player, being dragged along like a Gary's Mod character model. The term lazy is unfairly thrown about when discussing game development, but seeing these things plod towards the player, moaning and generally failing to catch up to them, I can't help but feel that their implementation is kinda half-assed. The game does let you get rid of the more troublesome ghosts using the rare sword item to pin them into the ground, which is certainly a good feature for getting rid of the annoying ones, but overall, the ghosts are more annoying than anything else. They're not frightening, they're irritating even when successfully avoided, and they take the player out of the experience with just how grating they can be. For those paying attention, I've used some variant of the phrase, take the player out of the experience for a while now, and that ties into one of my largest points about Silent Hill 4. While every single issue I've listed prior on its own wouldn't have been a deal breaker, it's a death by 1,000 cuts situation. All of these issues come together to get under the player's skin and take them out of the experience that Silent Hill 4 worked so hard to build. It's very hard to become immersed in the world of Silent Hill 4 when the gameplay falls so short in so many areas, doing everything possible to pull you into the atmosphere it's attempting to create. While I've given all past examples, the real death nail for Silent Hill 4 as a game is how all of these stack on top of each other, each one working in conjunction with the last to almost craft the most frustrating experience possible. And what makes this all worse is how so many of these gameplay design choices are direct steps backwards from the Silent Hill trilogy, which did many things The Room does, but much better. Pair that with the removed movement and difficulty options, and I can't honestly see an argument for Silent Hill 4 not being a direct downgrade from the games which precede it, even the PS1 original. Silent Hill 4's fan community has provided a counter to this. They argue that survival horror, and some games beyond even this genre, aren't meant to be fun in the way most people would describe it. A narrative-driven game will often put its storytelling, aesthetics, and atmosphere above how the game actually plays, with some counterintuitive game design choices implemented for the sake of the storytelling. This is a fair point, and many well-written games with excellent stories and atmospheres are lacking a little bit in the gameplay department. Generally speaking, however, these games go out of their way to make the gameplay a non-entity, something the player sails through in order to get to the real core of the experience, i.e. the story. In short, they go out of their way to not annoy the player with obnoxiously bad gameplay. For the most part. While I agree that games don't need to be fun, when their primary goal is to tell a compelling tale, the least they should do is present the player gameplay that doesn't intrude on the experience and irritate them. Here's the kicker though. There are some narrative-driven horror games which put gameplay in the back seat, were not fun in the traditional sense, yet were not annoying. Wanna know what they were? The Silent Hill trilogy, all 3 of them. They're not the best titles from a gameplay perspective, but the gameplay is serviceable and never got in the player's way to enjoy what really mattered. In short, the gameplay in the original trilogy was a vehicle to deliver the story and aesthetic work to the player. Good enough to not be annoying. This is the real difference between the trilogy and The Room. Silent Hill 4 has downright poor design in nearly every aspect and doesn't work as a method for the game to explore its other more interesting aspects. Whether or not Silent Hill 4 is bad on purpose is irrelevant, because at the end of the day, it's still just bad. Well, to be fair, it isn't like Silent Hill 4 is an abject failure in terms of its gameplay, as there's at least one feature that's fairly interesting. The titular room that Silent Hill 4 centers its concept and promotional material around is actually quite interesting from a gameplay perspective. The apartment acts as the game's hub, which the player has to return to constantly throughout the game's runtime. The need to return to the room is enforced through it having the only save point, as well as the new inventory that Silent Hill 4 uses. Instead of the paused, unlimited inventory that the past games used, Silent Hill 4 opts for a 10-slot real-time inventory, with an unlimited item box being located in the room itself. For the most part, I'm fine with the new limited inventory. These things are genre staples, and for what Team Silent wanted to accomplish with the room as a feature, it's a decent enough way to keep the player coming back. I wish the game allowed you to drop items manually from the inventory, and that ammo could stack so using guns would be more viable, but I digress. The room itself is presented as a first-person walking segment, similar to games at the time like Echo Night, where the player walks around room 302 and examines what's inside. You can look at Henry's belongings, out his windows, through a hole in his neighbor's place, organize your inventory, or just sit for a minute while any damage taken while in the other world slowly heals. For the first half of Silent Hill 4's runtime, the team does a good job of lulling the player into a false sense of security. As everyone who has ever heard about the room knows, this safety blanket is ripped away from the player once the second half begins. The room stops giving a passive healing buff, and now the player has to contend with the hauntings that will start to become a threat. These hauntings are basically randomized scares that pop up around the apartment, which do proximity damage like the ghosts do in the other world, and need to be dispelled with one of 2 items. As far as a major mechanical twist goes, I will concede that the room concept is itself extremely well done. It's clever, extremely effective on the first run, the game does a good job of pacing the build up to the payoff, and the scares being randomized helps out on repeat runs. Really, the only complaint I do have boils down to the hauntings themselves. While visually they are extremely varied and interesting, from a gameplay perspective, they're all very redundant. No matter what the haunting is, the cycle is exactly the same. Walk around the room looking for a haunting, find the haunting once the proximity damage effect starts going off or it makes itself plain obvious to you, and either stand around with a saint medallion near it, or place a holy candle in front of it. Either way, you wait for a few seconds, and then the haunting goes away. I'm gonna pay you one whole saint medallion to fuck off. The issue here is how this systematizes supernatural horror into a method that the player can easily wrap their head around. You quickly become comfortable around the hauntings, because no matter how visually interesting or unnerving they may initially be, the effect they have on the player is always exactly the same, as is the solution to them. it all becomes routine, which for horror is not ideal. A lot of the gameplay can best be described as not ideal, unfortunately, and the aesthetics of Silent Hill 4 don't fare too much better. No point starting on a sour note though, so let's look at something that I do enjoy. Just talking about the scares from a visual standpoint, it's impressive just how many there are. Just looking at the quantity, they're quite good. From a quality standpoint though, I feel that Silent Hill 4's use of scares is a little lacking when compared to the trilogy. While there are a few apartment scares that are interesting and effective, most of them are fairly rudimentary and uninteresting. Windows opening and closing, a TV turning on to white noise, bloody footprints, a clock going crazy, and so on. It also doesn't help that, as already mentioned, these are all dealt with in the exact same manner. Even outside of that, they lack the same punch that the scares of past games could have, with Silent Hill 3 being the clear winner in this regard. The mannequin room, the poorly haunted mansion, seeing the glutton for the first time, and the famous mirror room, these are all great horror set pieces which lack the randomization of Silent Hill 4's hauntings, but more than make up for it with stellar execution and variety from one another. Silent Hill 4 is too samey and it really falls flat in this regard. Just talking about the visuals in general, I'd say that the game is less impressive from both a visual performance and art direction perspective than the past three. And yes, I'm including the blocky PS1 Silent Hill in this discussion, obviously adjusting expectations for the tech available at the time. Let's tackle the former shortcoming first. Silent Hill 4 is much more visually static than the trilogy, with much less going on in the environments than its immediate predecessor and even the first two games to a lesser degree. The levels in the apartment are bland, lacking many unique details strewn about the environments that the past games had. And before anyone comments, look, I get it. I know what the levels are supposed to represent. They're Walter Sullivan's memories of past locations in his life that have personal significance to him, warped through his unstable mind. Yeah, I get it. But couldn't the game have tried to make the act of walking through the mind of a serial killer a bit more visually interesting? Most levels seem lifeless, gray, and just plain uninteresting to look at. It isn't like this is a brand new concept that Silent Hill 4 is tackling either, considering that every game in the trilogy before this had this exact premise. Having a character, or possibly multiple characters' psyches, act as the backdrop for the game's environments, each game littered with attention to detail or even just interesting things lying around to inform us more about them. While Silent Hill 4 is better for this than many other games on the market, when compared to what came before, it feels soulless. While we're on the never-ending comparison train, Silent Hill 4's equivalent to the pre-rendered CG cutscenes seen in the first two games look absolutely awful. They appear choppy, dirty, and straight up unprofessional, like an amateur attempt at creating something edgy and frightening. I get that this was in a lot of ways the style of the early 2000s, but the crisp look of Silent Hill 1's use of CG, just for contrast, is by far the superior method. Even Silent Hill 2 looked better when showing a cutscene caked in white noise, because at least that had some sort of context to it. And rounding out the biggest visual drawbacks, the use of lighting in Silent Hill 4 is downright poor. Even when going back to the pseudo-dynamic lighting effects seen in the first Silent Hill, the series has always prided itself on using this basic element of graphic design to its absolute fullest. Just look at how the real-time lighting looks in Silent Hill 2, often otherwise basic level. Or how the lighting affects certain aspects of these games, such as being unable to read the map in a dark area without a flashlight in Silent Hill 2, or how this boss can lose the player in the darkness if the flashlight is off in Silent Hill 3. Silent Hill 4 basically makes no effort in this regard. The flashlight is entirely absent, and the lighting in each area is static. While it's certainly less interesting, what makes it look so odd is how all of the shadows in Silent Hill 4 are just 2D images imposed on the environments. In most games this would be fine, but this is undoubtedly a clear downgrade from what came before. Also, there's a Comic Sans sign. People made a big deal of the Silent Hill HD collection using Comic Sans, and well, don't misunderstand me, it's awful there, it's just as silly an inclusion here. The art direction fares in a similar manner. Silent Hill 4 was the first game in the series without series artist Masahiro Ito working on it, and being frank, it shows. While the character designs are solid for the most part, that's about it for the positive. Let's start with the enemy designs, which, outside of the twin victims and the magician, look very uninspired. You have moldy dog, gray humanoid, flying bugs, and the common ghost types, which are just people. And let's not forget, Silent Hill 4 has evil wheelchairs as enemies. Not corrupted, monstrous reimagining of wheelchairs made out of flesh or something like that. Nah, nope. Just regular ass wheelchairs rolling around and attacking you. Even the 4 boss ghosts really aren't that special, outside of a somewhat interesting effect on Richard. I'd say that Silent Hill 4's enemy designs are about on par with the in-game models of Silent Hill 1. Specifically the in-game models, as the Ito renders are head and shoulders above all of them. The 4th Silent Hill's enemy design being on par with the first's, which was released a full generation ago on inferior hardware? That's not good, Chief. Paired with the drabber color palette and bare bones environments, Silent Hill 4 is lifeless when compared to what came before, and the audio work isn't much better. Now, let's get the big positives out of the way with the audio work, since there actually is some good stuff here. The soundtrack is fantastic, which really shouldn't come as a surprise. Any Silent Hill game that features Akira Yamaoka as the composer is bound to sound good, but Silent Hill 4 actually has some of my favorite work Yamaoka has done. The tracks fit the scenes perfectly, sound nice on their own, and everything has a more detached vibe to it. I don't know how to properly put it. I'm a musical half-wit myself, but it's a unique tone that sets Silent Hill 4 apart from the rest of the series. The voice acting is also fairly good too, barring the jarring, off-kilter performance given by Henry's actor. The cast sound their parts convincingly enough, and with only a few rare exceptions, their delivery is never off-putting. For a series with a reputation for bad voice acting, it's surprising how well the casts of 3 and 4 bring their characters to life. The real issues with Silent Hill 4's audio rear their head when you hear the game's downright awful effects. You can hear it from the raw amount of public domain audio samples, extremely unfitting choices like panther growls coming from dogs and monkey noises coming from the gumheads, to just ridiculous inclusions like the nurse equivalent burping every time it gets hit. I have no idea why a lot of these choices were made, because frankly they're laughable and sound amateurish. Past Silent Hill games made their names through the brilliant and meticulous audio design, and even Silent Hill 1 avoided using lifted public domain samples raw without some sort of tampering. Yamaoka would distort the familiar into something that becomes unrecognizable, which he did for many of the animal noises used for monster cries in Silent Hill 3. Or use unconventional sources, such as a dentist drill which was used for the final boss theme in the first game. Not only that, but past games put a great deal of effort into how the background audio contributed to the haunting atmosphere, with 2 and 3 being standouts for how well they handled ambient audio. Really listen to what's going on in the background of ostensibly silent areas, and you'll hear a quiet cacophony of metallic screeching, footsteps, and banging, labored breathing, and sometimes noises you really just can't identify at all. Like the visuals, Silent Hill 4 is barren in this regard, with many equivalent uses of audio just being lifted from past games. Really, to sum it all up, while Silent Hill 4's visuals and audio may fare better than its gameplay, and still do show aspects of that team's silent attention to detail which drew fans like myself into the series to begin with, it still feels like a first draft, or better yet, a rough build of a Silent Hill game when compared to its forebears. All is not lost, however, because Silent Hill 4's fanbase would argue that the true draw of this game lies in its story, something which they hold up as being the largest saving grace and the true reason as to why Silent Hill 4 is an underappreciated gem. And in that regard, I have to be blunt. The actual narrative and storytelling of Silent Hill 4 may be my biggest disappointment with the game as a whole.
I'm still in a dream, snake eater. I'm still in a dream, snake eater.
This is the big one. To really dig into Silent Hill 4's story, we have to break this up into two halves. First, we'll discuss the presentation of the story, how exactly Silent Hill 4 delivers its narrative to the player. After that, we'll talk about the actual content of the game's story. In both instances, I'll just stress this at the top. This is only my opinion on the matters. If you disagree, have a different reading, or see the quality where I don't, that's perfectly fine, and you know what? It's encouraged. Let me know where you think I'm going wrong on this, because, once again, just my opinion. Silent Hill 4 is closest stylistically to the original Silent Hill in terms of how the story is presented. Both leading men are intended to be the eyes-in, everyman protagonists for the audience. Another character is the story's real focus, with their own psyches providing the backdrop of the events, and the plot is delivered to the player piecemeal, slowly, and occasionally out of order over the game's runtime. This isn't an issue, but where Silent Hill 4 falls apart is mostly in the redundancy of its structure, and the way this plot is delivered to the player. Silent Hill 4 is much more structured than the past entries, with the game being broken down into chapters. These are the subway, forest, water prison, city, and apartment worlds, which you replay through twice over, and the hospital acting as something of an intermission. From a narrative standpoint, the issue here is that Silent Hill 4's structure is pretty much exactly the same for the first half in each chapter. Enter a new world in the fetal position, walk around for a bit, meet a new character you barely interact with, said character interacts with some form of Walter, and then said character dies. Rinse and repeat 5 times over. And while it does have something of a subversion when Eileen survives her assault from Walter, it doesn't fix how predictable the structure becomes after Jasper bites it. Silent Hill 4's presentation of its central cast is on the whole pretty odd. The vast majority of the characters are simply around to increase the body count, with only 3 members of the cast really mattering in the long run. The Silent Hill trilogy were generally pretty character-oriented stories, with smaller casts where each character has a deliberate reason to be in the game. None existed for the lone purpose of just biting the dust. Now, to be fair, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, a change in presentation isn't a negative necessarily, it's all down to the execution. Here's the problem with said execution. Silent Hill 4 seems to expect the player to sympathize with these characters, especially Cynthia and her drawn-out death scene. The key question I have to ask is, why? We know nothing about these randos, who exist by design to simply be victims for Walter to ice. So why should we be invested in their well-being? Hell, even Eileen herself, the most important side character in the game, isn't much to write home about. Before becoming a Walter victim, she's just the neighbor you see sweeping, staring off into space, and so on. We know that she's going out to a party with her friends later that day, yet that's the extent of it. Like Cynthia, Her death is played off as something extremely tragic, yet we know next to nothing about her. It's an odd direction. Actually, let's just go off on a bit of a tangent here because I have something to bring up about how bizarre Silent Hill 4's cutscenes are. Silent Hill 2 and 3 really had a knack for their cinematics, as the cutscenes in those games were extremely well directed with good shot placement and camera work. I'm no film expert, but for video games, these two really do look quite compelling, using their cinematic moments to express things to the audience through visual storytelling. Silent Hill 4, on the other hand, doesn't quite hit the same highs. It's fine, for the most part, but too often it ventures right into the silly territory. The introduction to Richard Braintree is just goofy, with him acting as aloof as possible. Seriously, his body language all throughout this scene just kills me. And the fact that he falls multiple stories on concrete and he only says ouch? Keynote, truly. Henry's reactions to things can be pretty funny too, with his indifference to Jasper and DeSalvo's deaths, his delayed shock to the phone cord getting cut, and the frequent utterance of, "What the hell?" And then there's the game's primary exposition dump cutscene, where a blatantly unfinished model hangs upside down on the roof and slowly repeats the phrase "kill," while the camera zooms in on his barely detailed face. Excuse my language, but this cutscene? This is fucking hilarious, mostly for just how unprofessional it looks. Being perfectly fair, it isn't like past Silent Hill games didn't swerve into being goofy either. For every Lisa Garland death scene, Maria behind the bars in the labyrinth, and
They look like monsters to you?
there's a Kaufman introduction, checkmate, and pizza. I guess the point I'm making is that while the original trilogy could still have those often silly moments, there were more cutscenes that were well done and stuck with you than there weren't. In contrast to this, Silent Hill 4 has the silly cutscenes but really lacks the impactful ones. A lot of this can be due to how the game's real narrative substance is delivered, but we'll get to that later. There is another issue with the presentation, and unfortunately there's no way to express it without sounding like a specific type of critic. The type not held in very high regard. So we'll just have to take a risk here, because I have to come out and say it. How Silent Hill 4 presents its female characters is bizarre, especially compared to the trilogy. Just for the record, I have no issue with big titty chicks and fan service in games. Lord knows I felt some things playing the Resident Evil games in the past. Dude, one day. One day.
But now that your
Just look at that.
has arrived,
That's the dream Chris is
I'll
living
leave
right
you
there.
to catch.
But Silent Hill has been very consistent with how it didn't portray its female cast like this. While they were fairly flat characters in Silent Hill 1, Sybil and Dahlia weren't played up for sex appeal. Admittedly, this would be hard to do on the PS1, but I digress. Silent Hill 2 and 3 were even better for this, with Angela, Heather, and Claudia all acting as fully realized characters, all while not being all dolled up for primetime. Hell, not being sexualized is crucial to Angela's design and characterization. The only real exception to this is Maria, which still works in Silent Hill 2's favor because she has a very specific reason to look and act the way she does. On top of that, Maria has a fairly interesting design choice. Notice how she isn't all that stacked, for lack of a better word. She isn't overly curvy or buxom. Maria's just a regular looking lady who acts and dresses seductively. When compared to the more subdued look of the past characters, Eileen and Cynthia, the only two female characters in Silent Hill 4 mind you, stand out even more. They're buxom eye candy, specifically designed in Eileen's case to have a big fat ass to look at, sauntering around in outfits showing off them goods. Now, being perfectly fair, Cynthia at least has something of a justification being the symbolic representation of temptation in the 21 Sacraments ritual. But Eileen? There's not much of an excuse there. I guess you could argue the party, but I think that's more of a case of the writers specifically writing in a half-baked reason for her to be dressed like that. The bonus costumes add to this. In Silent Hill 3, they were a little more fun and oddly innocent, with Heather getting t-shirts and the Princess Heart costume, and Douglas walking around in his boxers. Silent Hill 4, on the other hand, only has 2 bonus outfits for Eileen and Cynthia, which are sexy lingerie and a sexy nurse costume. For a schlocky horror game like Resident Evil or Haunting Ground, this would be a-okay. But for a Team Silent made Silent Hill game, which still expects that I take it seriously, these just feel out of place. It's even weirder when you realize that the explicit role that both characters play in the story is to be victims of a sex criminal by way of Walter Sullivan, who gets his jollies off by dissecting lady bodies. Eileen is even worse for this, as she's both a victim of Walter, his projected mommy GF, and an objective for Henry to protect and hook up with in the end. And I have to ask, who at Team Silent thought it was a good idea to make the bonus outfit for Eileen the sexy nurse costume? She's brutally beaten half to death with her arm, leg, and eye busted and bandaged up. She has numbers carved into her back. And what'd she get? Skimpy medical outfit. How did this pass by with no one questioning if it was in good taste or not? I've heard some people try to claim that Silent Hill 4 is intentionally subversive with this kind of presentation, and being frank, I don't buy it, and I've never heard a convincing argument in its favor. Look, I'm not saying that Silent Hill 4 is some evil, sexist game, or something inane like that, as I think anyone playing can tell it wasn't made with any ill intent in mind. But my issue with this really just boils down to how, speaking personally, I just can't take Cynthia and Eileen seriously as characters when they exist basically just to be walking eye candy. And finally, we come full circle with the main point of my prior complaints. The way the female characters are presented, the mediocre to goofy cutscenes, and the disposable cast who exist to inflate the body count. In short, it's really hard to take this one seriously. It comes across as an amateurish slasher flick at times. And when it's this hard to get invested in the events or any of the cast at all, it's even harder to give a hoot about what happens at all. If the aggravating gameplay and silly sound design didn't take you out of the experience, then these presentation issues probably will. Even if you do find Silent Hill 4 compelling in spite of this, you still have more presentation hurdles to get over. Namely, how the relevant events and details of the plot are delivered to the player, which leaves a lot to be desired. As said earlier, Silent Hill 4 is most similar in structure to the first game, with Walter Sullivan taking the role of Alessa in this example. Just to start off with a positive, I actually enjoy how the game slowly drip feeds the player information about Walter, overhearing the police radio chatter discussing details of the past murders, and having the 4 victims progressively become more frightened by his looming presence.
Henry, I found the exit. Come to the turnstile. Henry, I found the exit. Come to the turnstile. Hurry! Hurry! It's him.
He's gonna kill me. Walter's gonna kill me. He's gonna kill me.
This is all well done stuff, and really does an effective job at hyping Walter as this fearful boogeyman. What isn't well done is how Silent Hill 4 delivers the bulk of his rather detailed backstory to the player, which is especially troublesome considering that the Walter lore really is the game's main substance. So let's talk about notes. Note reading has been a staple of the survival horror genre since Alone in the Dark back in 1992, and the Silent Hill series has been no exception to this. These feature heavy in all 4 of the original games. Yet, as we discussed earlier, the quality of the notes in 4 was already lesser than what came before when you consider the lack of poetry puzzles or cleverly written puzzle hints. However, the most questionable choice Team Silent made with the notes in this game is how they seem to substitute the main plot. The actual plot of Silent Hill 4, as in the present events which transpire on screen, is a simple Nightmare on Elm Street style setup. The real focus of the writing is placed on Walter Sullivan's backstory, detailing his birth, up through his development in the cult, his murders, eventual suicide, and pseudo-resurrection. Once again, this isn't itself an issue. Silent Hill 1 was quite similar. The problem is, rather than deliver this information mostly through more compelling methods like character interaction or environmental storytelling, Silent Hill 4 gives the lion's share of this information to the player through notes. These notes are frequently pieces of rather detailed exposition, sprinkled all throughout the majority of the game, up until about the last fifth. While it's written from the perspective of an in-game character, Joseph Schreiber, they're all fairly dry, and read like a mandatory listing of relevant events from a wiki page, rather than a compelling horror narrative. Silent Hill has had exposition dumps in the past, with Silent Hill 3 having a lengthy cutscene that serves to summarize the events of Silent Hill 1, but there are some differences in how this exposition is utilized. In Silent Hill 3, this is mostly a way to get the audience up to speed who may have missed the relevant details, so the game can continue with its own plot knowing the audience is on the same page. In Silent Hill 3, the exposition supports the present narrative. In Silent Hill 4, on the other hand, it's not unfair to say that the exposition replaces the current events. The fact that they're presented through such unengaging means doesn't help matters. Making the notes of Silent Hill 4 the real source of the story content also has another drawback, as the game lacks the more interesting writing seen in the past games which didn't have any direct ties to the main plot, yet still served an important purpose. These notes gave the writers some breathing room to expand on or highlight main themes of the work, give insight into side characters, or simply just build the atmosphere a little. Think of Lisa's death note, every single piece of writing you find in Brookhaven from Silent Hill 2, the Stanley Coleman side quest, I could go on. This is a small selection of what I'm talking about, but the trilogy actually has a fair bit of these if you go back and look. They were a testament to what I consider to be Team Silent's defining characteristic, their meticulous attention to detail. Silent Hill 4 mostly lacks this detail in the writing, preferring to plainly spell out aspects of the backstory. This is what I mean when I say the note writing of Silent Hill 4 is worse than past games, as it lacks the nuance, detail, and variety seen in what came before. Although I do need to stress here, I'm criticizing the Team Silent writing staff for these choices, as Silent Hill 4's localization by Jeremy Blaustein, is once again fantastic. Jeremy is probably the most unsung individual member of the staff on these games, and I'd go as far as to say that people on this side of the pond wouldn't have the same positive reception to Silent Hill 2, 3, and yes, even 4, had he not done such good work. Back on topic, it isn't fair to say that Silent Hill 4 only limits itself to these expository notes from Joseph's perspective, as during the second run through the Forest World you can find many diary entries written by the young Walter Sullivan in red text all over the environment. As has been the case for Silent Hill 4 so far, the way these are presented to the player is the real problem. What is the specific issue this time, you ask? Well, it's the fact that only Eileen can read these messages, and the method of getting her to read them is extremely annoying. Rather than doing something as simple and intuitive as, say, examining the writing, having the game pause when Henry says he can't read the red text, and then, while still paused, having Eileen narrate the text, Silent Hill 4 decides to make it as irritating as possible. Eileen has to be positioned in front of the writing, and after waiting a second or two, she'll begin to read them out in real time. It's admittedly a neat concept, but it falls apart when paired with the fact that the player has so little control over Eileen's movement and actions that getting her in front of the text to read in the first place can be far more trouble than it should be. On top of that, some of this red text is placed in areas filled with enemies, meaning that the player can be attacked while attempting to pay attention to Eileen orating Walter's diary. Now, this isn't itself that bad, as you can always just kill the enemies that keep popping up to interrupt, but you can't kill the multitude of ghosts and Walter Sullivan himself who decide to halt the action. When either of these threats show up, the main issue being multiple ghosts flogging the player, they can follow the player around and completely bar their attempts to read the red text diary with the constant proximity damage and the threat of actual physical damage. The inquisitive player is in for a bad time here. The issue with the accessibility of this info is compounded with how the possession mechanic influences Eileen's ability to read. We should probably quickly go over how this thing works. Eileen has no health bar and is effectively immortal. However, when taking damage, she'll become increasingly possessed by Walter's influence, which causes changes to her character model and, depending on the severity, her in-game actions. Just to give another win to Silent Hill 4, this is actually an interesting system. It's subtle enough to miss, but can make for some interesting repeat runs while showing off some pretty solid voice work from Eileen's actress. Hell, some cutscenes are even altered by how possessed Eileen is. It's a nice touch. What relevance does any of this have to the red text diary? Well, Eileen can only accurately read from said text based on how possessed she currently is at that point. She can hardly read any at low level, read a decent amount at medium level, and can read all of it at high level. Herein lies the issue. Because Eileen only can become more possessed based on damage taken, which at no point is actually explained to the player, mind you, the only way for the interested player to receive more of the narrative is to purposely get Eileen damaged enough to read the text. Paired with the prior mentioned issues of positioning Eileen to read the text without interruptions in the first place, you can start to see how annoying the whole process is just to read some diary entries. It's odd that Silent Hill 4 would be this obtuse with delivering additional plot information, essentially from the horse's mouth, but so far I can at least respect the choice. Silent Hill 1 had a similar style of making the plot more cryptic than it arguably needed to be, but it was a style that the game stuck to, so I'm with that. Silent Hill 4, however, isn't consistent with this because very shortly after this section of the game, the writers essentially give up. You find 2 notes from Joseph in room 302 that essentially just spell out Walter's backstory to the player, piece by piece, point by point, which negates all the pomp and circumstance around the drip-fed style from beforehand. It's out of nowhere too, the game has been playing it close to the chest with all of this information, and then all of a sudden it just throws its hands in the air and gives you a laundry list of the tragic crap that happened to the poor serial killer Walter Sullivan. I never thought I'd find a style of storytelling that was both so obtuse and so ham-fisted at the same time, yet here we are. Really, this could sum up one of the worst trends of Silent Hill 4's story presentation on the whole. It never commits. Not to a style, a tone, or even a delivery method. Even still, a poor delivery of a story to an audience can be overlooked if the real content of said story is itself worthwhile. And this, my friends, is the last nail in the coffin for Silent Hill 4. I'd argue that a significant strength of Silent Hill's stories lie in their central cast of characters. And as we touched on briefly, this is an area where Silent Hill 4 falters. The majority of the cast are disposable bodies, true, but the unfortunate truth of the matter is that even the 3 characters that are significant to the narrative are themselves lackluster. We'll touch on Henry later, but his role in the story is largely irrelevant. Nah, the real star of the show here is the serial killer antagonist Walter Sullivan, whose backstory is the primary content and many would argue acts as the true main character for the game. Not to mention, the game takes place primarily within his mind, with his psyche, fears, and fixations creating the backdrop and enemies seen throughout. As I said earlier, he takes the role that Alessa did in the first Silent Hill. However, this is a comparison that does not bode well for Silent Hill 4. To be fair, there are a decent amount of parallels. Both were children raised in the cult, both abused by their caregivers from a young age, and both had a traumatic event which set the events of their respective games in motion. Maybe because of the already existing parallels with the first game, Silent Hill 4 takes all of these aspects and dials them up to 11. Walter's backstory, at least for my taste, is far too melodramatic and over the top for its own good. It was enough to just have Walter be a child of the cult, raised in an orphanage. No. The writers felt the need to construct the most cartoonish tragic backstory possible for him. He was abandoned by both of his parents in room 302 shortly after his birth, taken in by and raised by the cult, which would force him to live in a concrete panopticon where he was beaten and forced to drink leeches among other punishments, while learning how to perform numerous rituals for the cult. Apparently even Dahlia Gillespie, Alessa's mom, took very special interest in Walter to birth God, despite her daughter being the established plan in the first game, if all of that wasn't enough already. He became homeless afterward and lived in the subway outside of the South Ashfield apartment complex, getting shot down for creeping on Cynthia and her friends. In spite of this, and despite how he didn't seem to have any real formal education while living in the cult, he also entered medical school while working at a pet store to get the necessary skills to complete the 21 Sacraments ritual. Taking a look at all of that preamble, not even getting to Walter's actual murders, his suicide in prison, and the poorly explained resurrection within the otherworld as 2, possibly 3 different entities, it's hard not to see it as anything other than entirely absurd. The Silent Hill series is no stranger to having characters featured with very unfortunate backgrounds, so much so it's become something of a tired cliche, but Silent Hill 4 takes this way too far with Walter. All these events happening to one man within such a relatively short span of time, all of them having their tragedy dialed up to the nth degree, it makes the idea of all of these extremely unfortunate events befalling Walter become silly, not sympathetic. He's like a punching bag for the universe. Even this might have been something I could overlook, but the real issue I have with Walter is that, for all the talk of him being the true main character of the game, well, he really isn't much of a character at all. Really, what do we know about Walter as a person? We know that his goal is to return to room 302, which he thinks is his mom, and he wants to complete the 21 Sacraments ritual killings to rebirth her. He also might not like women that much based on how brutal and hands-on the kills of the female victims are compared to his male ones. So Walter has mommy issues and is a serial killer. For actual personality traits, that's really it. Also, his otherworld has plenty of mannequins gored and lying around. You know, cause serial killer. At most, you could call him a one-note antagonist, but the game clearly insists on the player sympathizing with Walter to some degree. Ignoring the fact that he's a serial killer who shoots his load off while cutting up bodies, there just isn't enough of a character here to dig into, really. What are his likes, dislikes? How is he as a person in day-to-day life? When it comes to characters, especially more passive ones like Walter generally seems to be, a surefire way to show the kind of person they are is by showing how they react to certain events or people. Due to how Silent Hill 4 structures itself though, we really can't do this for Walter since every defining action in his life happens well before the present events. We're given a laundry list of things that happen to him, but we don't see his live reactions to these occurrences. Hell, adding insult to injury, it isn't even Wilder that we're interacting with in Silent Hill 4's present events. Instead, his otherworld copies, or tulpas I guess, akin to Lisa Garland or Maria. Being blunt, Walter really isn't a character, instead he's a tragic backstory given a name. Frankly, that's something I don't at all find compelling. It's not to say that Alessa's backstory wasn't fairly dire too, but rather than one more in an endless series of grim events, her burning and the rituals surrounding it were merely the stories inciting incident. Her life before that was unfortunate, sure, but from the bullying from her schoolmates to her mother's abuse, it was a more grounded series of unfortunate events. As such, it's both easier to relate to Alessa's backstory and easier to buy. Outside of that, she lived a regular life. She had personal interests outside of the cult, a school life, and as Silent Hill 3 showed us, an actual childhood friend. It's not an over-the-top, endless series of grim, dark doom and gloom, which in turn makes it easier for the player to swallow. Another character to compare to Walter is Claudia Wolf, the antagonist of Silent Hill 3. She's another character with some decent parallels to Walter. Both are prominent figures in the cult attempting to complete maternal-themed rituals, and both were abused children who grew up under the cult's wings. For a lot of players who just run through the game, it would actually be easy to write Claudia off as a fairly generic villain as well, lacking any real substance, but the devil here is in the details. When Heather first encounters Claudia in Silent Hill 3, she comes across as aloof, stoic, and clearly in control of the situation. She has an air of menace to her, silent menace, from her introduction to her second meeting with Heather after killing Harry Mason. Where Claudia becomes interesting is when you see her interactions with characters in the game's second half. When speaking with Vincent, who has known her personally for quite some time before the game's events, she comes across as a frightened and meek individual, rather than the silent, powerful figure we encountered earlier. And from her meeting with Douglas and from the church encounter with Heather, where we see for a split second she believes that her childhood friend Alessa has returned, the audience can gather something from her earnest and frankly naive mannerisms. For all of her presentation and wearing of the stone-cold mask, Claudia is a lonely, frightened woman-child who never really grew up. She knows few pleasures in this world, with her only real positive link to it, i.e. her friendship with Alyssa, being stolen from her at a young age. This isn't an analysis of her character, but the player is given enough direct information to know who exactly Claudia is as an individual, rounds her out into an actually compelling antagonist and character in her own right, and does this without lecturing the player for minutes on minutes with exposition about her backstory. From her aforementioned direct interactions with other characters which show facets of her projected and real personality, to even small things like her journal and details found around her bedroom, Claudia has a little more going on under the surface. The game isn't in your face about it too, but for those willing to do some light work, there's actually a fair bit to read into. I keep going back to the plot elements from the Silent Hill trilogy while discussing Walter, and it's only to show how, on top of being a poorly written non-entity of a character, Walter just isn't all that novel a figure. For a game praised for its originality, it's very interesting how often it retreads what came before with what the game's audience argues is its true leading man. Speaking of retreading, let's actually start discussing the game's playable protagonist. Like Harry Mason, Henry Townshend acts as the audience's eyes in for the game's events. He's ignorant to the plot and uncovers its aspects alongside the audience, and is essentially the normal straight man to the more surreal aspects of the game. The main difference between Harry and Henry is that Harry is still more of a character than his counterpart, even as simple as he is. Harry has a tangible motivation for going through the hell that he does, his actions are consistent with his motivation, and it expresses reactions to the unreal horrors that happen before his eyes. On the other hand, Henry is just nothing. He hardly emotes, and when he does, he's very inconsistent about it, and lacks any real clear personality traits beyond being quiet or shy, I guess. The reason for this is simple. Henry is an avatar for the player to project themselves onto, not an actual protagonist. This is in my opinion, don't take my word for it either. Here's a direct quote from an interview with Team Silent members. Henry is intentionally designed to be as bland as possible to better allow for players to push their own feelings and motivations onto him. The reason I'm hammering this point home is that many people's interpretations and readings of Silent Hill 4 rely on some aspect of Henry being a defined trait, which invalidates them because, simply put, he has none by design. Being honest, more often than not, I feel that whatever personal hangups the analysts in question have is what they're arguing Silent Hill 4 is truly about, when in reality it's just them projecting their own insecurities and issues. 3 common readings include that Silent Hill 4 is about depression, anxiety, and voyeurism, so we'll touch on these briefly to explain why they really don't work. At least when they use Henry as a justification. A defense of Henry as a non-entity is that these are all just symptoms of Henry's depression, from his lack of reaction to events to his monotone delivery. They then argue that Silent Hill 4 is about escaping said condition. Ignoring how Henry is officially a blank slate by design and these elements are merely reflections of that writing decision, there are some other issues with this reading. Saying that Henry is depressed actively contradicts a factual statement made about him in the opening third-person text scroll, which directly states that Henry has been happy since living in his new apartment. There's no reason to doubt this narration either, as there's no implication that the narration is in any way unreliable. Most of the details which proponents of the Henry is depressed reading call on can all be easily chalked up to him having an intentional lack of character to better act as an avatar, or for other simpler reasons. Room 302 is dull and lifeless due to Silent Hill 4 taking a hit to the modeling detail as we discussed earlier. His quiet nature is extremely common with these type of protagonists, and the details of his family and friends not checking in on him and his apparent unsentimental childhood boil down to Henry's background and personal life being entirely irrelevant to the story at hand. And this is ignoring the word of God from the creative staff, which has directly said on multiple occasions that Henry is designed to be as normal and unremarkable as possible. And even if this aspect wasn't a projection, Silent Hill 4 isn't necessarily about depression, as this aspect simply doesn't line up with the Walter plotline, the true story being explored here. Really, this is the biggest issue I have with the column and thematic readings of Silent Hill 4, the separation between what the supposed themes of the game are and the Walter content. The anxiety interpretation has the same flawed reasoning as does the impression interpretation, and the whole erotic voyeurism angle is extremely silly in context. For one thing, Henry never actively participated in making the hole to Eileen's apartment, as it was one of Joseph's attempts to escape the room before him. And if he was so erotically fixated on Eileen like the perv he apparently is, why didn't he express any sort of interest in her before any of the good endings? And even the act of peeping through the hole in Eileen's place can be excused given the story's current context, considering that Henry has been trapped in his apartment for 5 days before the game's events. At that point, I think anybody would be desperate enough to obsessively look for any way out that they could. As I said earlier, I think these readings just boil down to projection from the analyst in question. Someone with depression might read it that way, someone with anxiety in that direction, and someone concerned about sexual perversion in that matter. And even if all of these readings had a stronger basis, they'd still be largely irrelevant to the Walter plotline. While Silent Hill 4 might have inklings and hints of potential themes, possibly even the 3 aforementioned, the game fails to actually explore any of them beyond the most surface of levels, and fails to integrate these ideas into its actual story content. Even if they were here, Silent Hill 4 does little work in actually exploring them. In the end, this is my biggest issue with Silent Hill 4's story. It really isn't doing much. It isn't an effective character piece due to its lackluster cast and odd choices made in the writing and presentation, and it barely touches on any themes to explore them well enough. And that's paired with the presentation issues, which take any interesting idea that Silent Hill 4 did have for its story and delivers them in such an obtuse manner that it prevents any of them from sticking the landing. In short, Silent Hill 4's story is an absolute mess which, while interesting on paper and in bullet point form, is botched entirely in its execution. If there's some kind of deeper meaning here, then I'm just not seeing it. This wasn't anywhere near my longest script to write, but it was by far the most exhausting. Even at the end here, I'm not sure if I accurately got out my thoughts on Silent Hill 4, if I was actually fair with my criticisms, if the script itself is even worth a damn, and so on. I don't think I'm ever going to be happy with it, so best to put it out as it is and let others be the judge. I think why this one in particular is so tiring for me to write is because, at the end of the day, I'm given an extremely negative take on a series that I love to bits in a studio I have nothing but respect for. I love Silent Hill. Warts and all, I'd easily consider the original trilogy my favorite games, if not my favorite pieces of media, period. Which is why, despite everything I've said up until now, I still won't claim to hate Silent Hill 4. I meant it at the beginning when I said I wanted to like this game, and I really tried to see what other people are starting to see now. I want to like Silent Hill 4, I really do, and for the longest time, I kept going back to it, trying to find the missing piece that I wasn't finding beforehand, the element that the game's fans found, which would completely change my opinion on the game. At this point, having gone through it in detail, I think I've cemented my stance on Silent Hill 4. Here's the point I'd want to end on though. Even if I've gone through nearly every reason as to why I don't like Silent Hill 4, the real question is this. Why should you care? No, really. If there's one thing I've seen while watching and reading other people's defenses of Silent Hill 4, it's that this game has struck a nerve with its audience. I've seen numerous impassioned defenses of Silent Hill 4, most of which completely disagree with things that I've said to the game's detriment. Clearly, there's some kind of merit here that I'm just not seeing, and if you enjoy Silent Hill 4, who the hell am I to tell you that you're wrong? This is one of the things that I love about Silent Hill as a series, just how passionate its fans are, and the discussions they're eager to have with their favorite games. So, I guess to conclude, I've come to respect Silent Hill 4 if only for this reason. The discussion it's inspired is fascinating, and while you're certainly justified in your enjoyment of the game, I just wanted to argue my case, justifying why I still just cannot get into it for the life of me.